The Hidden Life of Mandela, Loves, Enemies, and Decisions That Changed the World. After decades in prison, after the applause, the handshakes, and the world's eyes on him, Mandela would often return home to silence. Not the silence of solitude, but of distance. His marriage to Winnie had survived Robben Island, survived exile, survived public scrutiny. But now, in the quiet halls of his presidential residence, he could feel the distance like a physical presence. The bed was made every morning, untouched. The letters between them, once filled with longing and revolution, had turned cold. Timed, filtered, painfully polite. Mandela loved Winnie. But something had changed. The woman who once carried the torch while he was behind bars had become hardened by the war she fought alone. In the shadows of the townships, her reputation was stained by whispers about revenge squads, about questionable alliances, about actions that contradicted the principles they once shared. Mandela read these reports with a knot in his chest. He didn't want to believe them, but as president, he was forced to listen. At night, he would sit by the window and stare at the city lights. A leader by day, a man alone by night. Sometimes he asked himself, did the prison change her? Or did it change me? Their bodies had been separated for decades, but now it was their souls that could no longer touch. In speeches, he smiled. In interviews, he praised her strength. But in private, Mandela was breaking. Because behind every great man, there is often a love story the world will never fully understand. Leadership requires trust. And trust, Mandela learned, is a currency more fragile than hope. As president, he surrounded himself with former comrades, intellectuals, seasoned politicians. But among them were ambitions that no oath could silence. Some saw Mandela as a bridge. Others saw him as a stepping stone. He would enter meetings where allies praised his vision, but hours later, leaked documents revealed they were undermining him. He discovered phone calls recorded, minutes of meetings missing, and worst of all, decisions being made in his name without his knowledge. Some advisors feared that Mandela's insistence on unity, on forgiveness, was weakness. They wanted retribution. They wanted power. And slowly, he realized the war outside had ended. But a quieter, more dangerous war was now within his circle. He kept his composure, but his notebooks told the truth. He wrote everything, quietly. Names, patterns, betrayals. One entry read, I have learned that loyalty in politics is often just ambition wearing a uniform. Still, he chose patience. He believed in letting masks fall naturally. But it hurt him, deeply, because some of these men had shared prison walls with him, had shared laughter, pain, and sacrifice. And now, they shared secrets he was not allowed to know. You, watching this now, have you ever felt surrounded by people who smile, but sharpen knives behind your back? There's a specific kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from being beside someone who no longer reaches you. When Nelson Mandela walked free from Victor Verster prison, the world rejoiced. But behind closed doors, a more painful sentence began. His return to civilian life meant returning to a marriage that no longer resembled the fire it once held. Winnie, once his anchor through prison walls, had become a storm of her own. Their emotional compass had shifted. Their languages of love no longer aligned. During his imprisonment, Mandela held on to Winnie through memory and letters. Words were their only form of intimacy. But time plays cruel tricks on hope. While he was isolated, she was forged by fire, exiled, hunted, and hardened by the streets of Soweto. The woman who had once pleaded for his freedom was now feared for her militancy. Whispers turned into headlines. And the man who had become a global symbol of peace was married to a woman accused of commanding vengeance. At the presidential residence, there were no arguments, no screaming matches, just cold civility. They dined in silence. They slept apart. Sometimes, they would pass one another in the hallways like strangers forced to share a memory. The public image had to be protected, but the truth was raw. The couple had become relics of a revolution, emotionally stranded in different decades. Mandela, ever the diplomat, masked his grief in grace. But he wrote about it, quietly, candidly. In his journal, he once described his heart as a room once lit with fire, now covered in cold ash. It wasn't hate. It wasn't betrayal. It was the quiet mourning of a love that had no grave, but had clearly died. And yet, the world demanded they keep the illusion alive, for unity, for legacy, for politics. His nights were often spent alone by the window, staring at the lights of Pretoria, wondering, how do you rebuild a country when you can't even rebuild your home? How do you lead millions when the person who once gave you strength now brings only silence? Mandela was a leader to the world, but a man behind that door, wounded, conflicted, and quietly grieving the one thing no power could restore: connection. To govern a wounded nation requires strategy, but to survive within the halls of power requires something far more elusive: instinct. Mandela was not naive. He had endured sabotage, betrayal, and infiltration during the anti-apartheid struggle. Yet, as president, he faced a new breed of enemy, the kind that wears your colors, speaks your slogans, and shares your table while plotting your fall. At cabinet meetings, some men applauded his vision of reconciliation. They toasted unity. But in private, they saw his forgiveness as weakness, an opening for power plays. There were leaks to the press, budget diversions, and whispers of internal coups. Mandela had to remain composed, but he was no fool. He had been betrayed before, by men who smiled as they passed him messages, by allies who later confessed they were double agents. Now, those patterns were returning, in suits and polished shoes. Among his most difficult realizations was this: not all revolutionaries make good rulers. Some comrades from the liberation movement were intoxicated by proximity to power. They had fought oppression, but now fought each other for influence, contracts, control. Mandela understood the cost of mistrust, but also the cost of misplaced faith. And so, he developed a quiet strategy: observe, document, and wait. He kept notebooks, not official ones, but private records. In neat handwriting, he recorded patterns, names, shifts in loyalty. He rarely confronted directly. He believed in allowing people to reveal themselves. But the hurt ran deep. Some of the very men who had shared prison cells with him were now more interested in presidential favors than principles. The betrayal wasn't just political, it was personal. One late night, while revising a speech, Mandela reportedly told a close aide, "My enemies were easier to understand. My friends, they carry hidden knives." Still, he refused to purge his cabinet. He saw leadership not as domination, but endurance. He knew that exposing a traitor too early could fracture the fragile peace. Instead, he waited, with dignity, with pain, and with the deep sorrow of a man who realized that the greater the crown, the sharper the daggers that follow you into silence. Escrita realista, emotional e conectada, ideal para narrador e video com imagens lentas e reflexivas. For the public, Mandela was a saint. But for many within South Africa, especially those still living in poverty, still unemployed, still without basic services, he was just another politician. Expectations were monumental. Some believed he would redistribute land overnight. Others hoped he would jail the architects of apartheid. When none of that happened quickly enough, the whispers began. Had Mandela compromised too much? In the townships, where fire once symbolized freedom, it now represented frustration. Strikes surged. Protests turned violent. "Mandela is not Jesus," said one young activist. "He can't forgive on our behalf." That was the pain of leadership. Even when you're sincere, you're accused of betrayal by those you try to help. And Mandela felt that deeply, because he hadn't promised miracles, only progress. He once walked into a rural school unannounced. No cameras, no press, just Mandela, the old man, sitting beside students and listening. A teacher asked him if he ever regretted choosing peace. Mandela looked out the window and replied, "I regret that peace is so slow." That moment never made the headlines, but it captured the ache he carried, the gap between what people needed and what he could deliver. He had chosen unity over vengeance, institutions over emotions. But that didn't stop the criticism. Some called him a puppet of the West. Others accused him of protecting the white elite. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, yet was booed in his own neighborhoods. That paradox would haunt him until his final breath, being globally adored but locally questioned. And yet, Mandela never lashed out. He never weaponized the media. He never shut down dissent. He believed that democracy meant hearing even the voices that hurt him most. But in his diary, he confessed, "The hardest part of freedom is realizing that those you freed may still turn away from you." That was his burden, and he carried it with grace. The final conversation with Winnie, their separation was public, but their closure was private. After months of silent tension and legal proceedings, Mandela and Winnie agreed to meet, alone. No aides, no lawyers, no cameras, just two people who had once loved each other deeply, sitting face to face for the first time in what felt like centuries. The room was quiet. Mandela composed, Winnie strong-eyed. For a while, they didn't speak, just looked at one another, as if trying to locate the past and the present. Finally, Mandela broke the silence. "Do you hate me?" he asked. Winnie smiled sadly. "No," she said, "but I no longer recognize you." That line shattered him more than any prison sentence ever had. They spoke of everything: the exile, the accusations, the wounds never acknowledged. Winnie defended her actions. Mandela explained his decisions. There was no shouting, only truths. Painful, honest truths. He told her he missed the woman who once held his hand through steel bars. She told him that woman had to become steel herself to survive. That conversation lasted 4 hours. By the end, no reconciliation was reached. But something else happened, an understanding. Not forgiveness, not reunion, just the mutual acknowledgement that both had been broken in different ways by the same struggle. They stood up, hugged once, and walked away without looking back. Mandela never spoke of that day publicly, but in an unpublished letter to a friend, he wrote, "Love is not always a shelter. Sometimes it's the battlefield where two souls, once united, are taught how to say goodbye." And in that goodbye, Mandela closed the most personal chapter of his revolutionary life, with dignity, pain, and peace. The decision that changed everything. As his term neared its end, the ANC begged him to run again. Global leaders urged him. Polls showed he'd win easily. But Mandela made a decision that stunned the world and disappointed many around him. He would not seek re-election. He would step down, not because he was tired, not because he had failed, but because he believed in something bigger than power: transition. South Africa had never seen peaceful power transfer before. The fear was real. If Mandela left, would everything collapse? Would violence return? Would his enemies inside the party devour his successor? But Mandela remained firm. "If I do not step down," he said, "I will become the very thing I once fought against, a leader who overstays." Behind closed doors, some accused him of abandoning the revolution. But Mandela saw the long game. He wasn't just building a government. He was building a culture, one where leadership doesn't mean eternal rule, but the ability to pass the torch. His choice wasn't just political. It was philosophical. In stepping down, he was stepping up to something greater. On his last day in office, Mandela walked through the halls slowly, taking it all in. Staff lined up to shake his hand. Some cried, some simply nodded. As he exited, he paused at the door, looked back, and whispered, "Let the work continue." He walked out, not into retirement, but into legacy. That single decision, leaving when he didn't have to, changed the entire DNA of African politics. It taught the world that real power lies not in holding on, but in letting go. And with that, Mandela sealed his story, not just as a liberator, not just as a president, but as a man who never let ego speak louder than principle. The man behind the myth, Nelson Mandela's life was not made of statues or speeches. It was built on heartbreak, silence, moral conflict, and the unshakable decision to serve, even when misunderstood. Behind the applause were betrayals. Behind the legacy were losses. But through it all, Mandela remained one thing above all: human. He loved fiercely. He forgave deeply. He endured quietly. And he chose what few leaders dare to choose: humility in the face of fame, simplicity in the seat of power. In this final chapter of our series, we've seen Mandela not just as a hero, but as a man torn between love and duty, friendship and betrayal, identity and image. What do you think about the man behind the myth? Did any part of his private story resonate with your own journey? Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your reflections. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next episodes. And if you found Mandela's story as moving as we did, stay tuned for the next series exploring another hidden life that changed the world. We'll see you there.